Why were 2 mother dogs and 3 puppies taken and left trapped in a steel cage, dangling dangerously high above an abandoned construction site? Imagine if those helpless lives depended on you. How far would you go, and what risks would you take to bring them back to safety? The soft golden light of a perfect morning filtered through the trees at Pinewood Park. Families strolled leisurely, children's laughter rang out, and dogs of every shape and size ran freely across the open fields. The park was alive with joy and peace, a welcome escape from the chaos of everyday life. James Wellingham, a young billionaire whose name was synonymous with innovation and success, walked calmly along the paved paths with his beloved golden retriever Mia and her 3 lively puppies, Max, Charlie, and Bella. Dressed casually in a navy sweater and dark jeans, James looked every bit the doting dog owner, a rare sight for someone of his stature. Mia walked confidently at his side, her glossy golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Her puppies bounced around her, their little tails wagging furiously as they explored every inch of the grassy field. To James, this wasn't just a morning walk. It was a cherished moment with the ones who had brought warmth and companionship into his otherwise solitary life. "Mia, come here," James called gently, watching her ears perk up before she trotted back to him with the puppies following behind. He smiled, crouching down to scratch her ears. Good girl. Not far from where James strolled, Eliza Hart stood by the edge of the park's playground, keeping a watchful eye on her 8-year-old son, Ben. She was dressed in a light jacket and worn jeans, her auburn hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Next to her stood Daisy, the family's golden retriever, who had been with them through thick and thin. Ben was tossing a frisbee high into the air, and Daisy leapt gracefully to catch it, her movements fluid and elegant. "Great job, Daisy!" Ben shouted, clapping his hands as Daisy trotted back with the frisbee in her mouth. Eliza smiled softly. Despite the challenges of being a single mother, long hours at the diner, endless bills to pay, and the weight of raising Ben alone, moments like these made it all worthwhile. "Don't run too far, Ben," Eliza called out, watching him dash toward an open field. It was in this open field that Mia and Daisy's paths first crossed. The 2 golden retrievers, so strikingly similar, seemed to notice each other immediately. Daisy approached Mia cautiously, her tail wagging low in curiosity, while Mia paused, studying the newcomer. The resemblance between the 2 was uncanny, the same shiny golden coats, the same warm brown eyes, and even the same gentle grace in their movements. James noticed first, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Well, that's a rare sight," he murmured as Daisy walked up to Mia. Eliza, following Daisy, blinked in astonishment. "They look identical," she said, half laughing as she stopped beside her dog. James glanced at her and smiled faintly. "I've never seen another dog that looks so much like Mia. It's almost like they're twins." "She's Daisy," Eliza said, crouching down to pet her dog's head. "We've had her since Ben was born. She's been with us through everything." "Mia's been with me for years," James replied, his voice softening. "She's my family." The 2 dogs began sniffing each other, their tails wagging in perfect unison. It was as though they recognized a kindred spirit. Around them, a small group of park-goers had gathered, watching the scene unfold. The sight of 2 nearly identical golden retrievers, surrounded by 3 excitable puppies, drew curious whispers and amused smiles. "They're like twins," one person remarked, snapping a quick photo. "I can't tell which is which," another said, laughing. Eliza shook her head, chuckling. "This is a first. Daisy's always been one of a kind." James smiled slightly. "Not today, apparently." As the conversation continued, Mia and Daisy settled into a comfortable companionship, sitting side by side while the puppies tumbled around them. Ben crouched nearby, playing with Max, who barked excitedly as the boy rolled a ball across the grass. Unbeknownst to James and Eliza, they were being watched. From the shade of a nearby tree, 2 men stood observing the scene, their eyes locked on Mia and Daisy. These weren't ordinary park visitors. They were part of a small but dangerous group specializing in kidnappings. For weeks, they had been following James, studying his routines and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "That's the dog," one of them muttered, gesturing towards Mia. "Are you sure?" the other asked, squinting to get a better look. "Yeah, I'm sure," the first man said. "The billionaire loves her. We grab the dog, we get the money." The second man hesitated, his gaze shifting to Daisy. "Wait a minute. That other dog looks just like her." The first man frowned, noticing the resemblance for the first time. "Which one's which?" "How should I know?" the second man replied. "They're identical." For a moment they stood in silence, watching as the two dogs sat together in the grass. Then the first man spoke, his voice firm. "We take them both," he said. "And the puppies, too. No mistakes, no loose ends." The second man nodded, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Let's do it." As James and Eliza continued their light-hearted conversation, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby, the two men began to move, blending into the crowd as they prepared to execute their plan. To them, this wasn't just a crime, it was an opportunity, and they weren't about to let it slip away. The morning that had begun so peacefully now felt like a distant memory as James Wellingham approached his car with a fresh cup of coffee in hand. He'd only been gone a few minutes, confident that Mia and the puppies would remain safe under the watchful eye of nearby park-goers. But when he reached the spot where he had tied Mia's leash to a sturdy bench, his heart dropped. The leash was there, cut cleanly at the middle, but Mia and the puppies were gone. James's pulse quickened as he scanned the park, his sharp blue eyes darting across the open fields and winding paths. "Mia!" he called, his voice louder than he intended. "Max? Charlie? Bella?" The cheerful hum of the park continued around him, oblivious to his growing panic. His mind raced. Mia was well trained. She wouldn't wander off. Someone had taken them. Not far away, Eliza Hart was experiencing her own moment of horror. She had been chatting with another mother near the playground, while Ben played with Daisy. When she turned back to check on her dog, she found an empty patch of grass where Daisy had been sitting. "Ben," Eliza called out, rushing toward her son. "Where's Daisy?" Ben looked up, his face confused. "She was just here," he said, looking around frantically. Eliza felt her stomach churn as she searched the area. Daisy's leash, like Mia's, was lying on the ground, severed. "Daisy!" Eliza shouted, her voice trembling. She grabbed Ben's hand, her mind flashing through every worst-case scenario. Daisy would never run away. This had to be something else. James's and Eliza's paths crossed again near the park's fountain, though the circumstances were far from the light-hearted encounter they'd shared earlier. James spotted Eliza first, clutching Ben's hand as she hurried past, her face pale with worry. "Did you see a golden retriever?" James asked abruptly, stepping into her path. "Mia and her puppies are missing." Eliza stopped short, her breath catching. "Daisy's gone too," she said, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know what happened." James's sharp gaze scanned her face, his initial concern giving way to suspicion. "Two dogs disappear at the same time. What are the chances of that?" Eliza bristled at his tone. "Are you implying I had something to do with it?" "I don't know," James said evenly, "but this isn't a coincidence." Before Eliza could respond, Ben tugged on her hand. "Mum, look," he said, pointing toward the edge of the park. Both adults turned to see a set of fresh tire tracks leading away from the grassy field where the dogs had been. Nearby, discarded leashes and bits of rope lay strewn on the ground. James crouched down to examine the tracks, his jaw tightening. "A van," he muttered, running his fingers over the deep grooves in the dirt. Eliza knelt beside him, her earlier defensiveness replaced by fear. "They took Daisy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And Mia," James said grimly. He stood, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "This wasn't random. Someone's been watching." Eliza stared at him, her confusion evident. "Watching? What do you mean?" James hesitated. He didn't want to alarm her, but the facts were undeniable. "I think they were after Mia. I've noticed people watching us before, but I didn't think much of it. She's important to me." Eliza frowned. "Then why would they take Daisy?" James's expression darkened. "Because they couldn't tell the difference. Your dog looks just like her." Eliza sank onto the bench, her hand covering her mouth. "This can't be happening," she murmured. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Listen to me. Panicking won't help. We need to act fast if we're going to get them back." Eliza looked up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. "How? What can we do?" James's experience in high-stakes situations began to take over. He pulled out his phone and opened a note-taking app. "We start with what we know," he said, his tone calm but firm. "The van, the tracks, they can't have gone far." Eliza nodded, her earlier hesitation fading as she realized he was right. "What about the police?" she asked. James hesitated. "We'll call them if we have to, but whoever did this might get spooked and hurt the dogs if they think they're being chased. For now, it's just us." Eliza took a deep breath, glancing at Ben. "Okay," she said, her voice steadying. "What do we do first?" James stood and gestured toward the tracks. "We follow these as far as we can. If we lose the trail, we'll split up and ask around. Someone must have seen something." Eliza nodded, tightening her grip on Ben's hand. "Let's go." As the three of them set off, James couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Somewhere out there, Mia, Daisy, and the puppies were in danger, and he wasn't going to stop until they were safe. The tension in the room was palpable as James Wellingham stared at his phone. He had been pacing back and forth in the small cafe where he, Eliza, and Ben had stopped to regroup after following the tire tracks. His phone vibrated on the table, its sharp buzz breaking the silence. When James picked it up, his face darkened. The message came from an unknown number, and it contained only a few words, accompanied by an image. "We have your dogs. Follow instructions, or they die." The image below the text was chilling. Mia, Daisy, and the three puppies were crammed into a steel cage, their wide, frightened eyes staring out at the camera. The cage was suspended high above the ground by a crane, dangling precariously in what appeared to be an abandoned construction site. The rusted metal of the crane and the shadowy surroundings made the situation feel even more dangerous. James's jaw clenched as he handed the phone to Eliza. Her face paled as she took it, her hand trembling. "Daisy," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ben peered over her shoulder, his eyes widening. "Mom, is Daisy okay?" Eliza swallowed hard, trying to stay composed for her son. "She's scared, Ben, but we'll get her back, I promise." James's voice cut through the tension. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his tone cold and analytical. "The cage, the height, it's all about pressure. They want us to panic." Eliza scrolled through the message, her hands shaking slightly. "They want money, don't they?" James nodded grimly. "It's a ransom. They're betting on my wealth and my connection to Mia to force me to pay." Eliza glanced back at the image. "And Daisy, they must have taken her because she looks like Mia. They didn't want to risk grabbing the wrong dog." James tapped the screen, opening the full message thread. Another text had come through. $10 million, no police. We'll contact you with drop-off instructions." Eliza gasped. $10 million? James stared at the phone, his mind racing. "It's not about the money. It's about how far they're willing to go to intimidate us. That cage. They're threatening to kill them if we don't comply." James set the phone down and looked at Eliza, his gaze steady. "We're not calling the police. Not yet." Eliza hesitated, torn between fear and trust. "Why not?" "They could help." "Because if the kidnappers even think we've involved the police, they might hurt the dogs, or worse," James replied firmly. "They've already proven they're willing to put them in danger." Eliza's heart sank as she glanced at the image again. Mia and Daisy, usually so calm and composed, looked terrified. The puppies, huddled close together, seemed too young to fully understand what was happening, but their wide eyes mirrored the fear of their mothers. James exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "We need to figure out where they're keeping them." Eliza nodded, her determination hardening. "The message doesn't give much away, but the photo might. There's got to be something in the background that can help us." She handed the phone back to James, and they both leaned in, examining the image closely. The crane was rusted, its paint peeling in large patches. The ground below was cracked concrete with faint yellow markings, likely remnants of a parking lot. "Look here," Eliza said, pointing to a corner of the image. "There's a pile of broken bricks and some scaffolding. This has to be an abandoned construction site." James nodded. "There's also graffiti on the crane. It looks fresh. That could help narrow it down." Ben, who had been quietly watching, piped up. "What about the tires? The ones we saw at the park?" Eliza's eyes lit up. "Yes, the tracks we followed. They must lead to wherever this is." James pulled out his phone again, opening the GPS app. "There are only a few abandoned construction sites within a reasonable distance from the park. If we follow the tracks and compare them to this photo, we should be able to find it." James and Eliza quickly finished their coffee and gathered their things, ready to head back to where they'd found the tracks. But before they left, James paused, looking at Eliza with a serious expression. "This is going to get dangerous," he said quietly. "Whoever these people are, they're professionals. If you want to step back—" "No," Eliza interrupted firmly. "Daisy is out there, and so are Mia and those puppies. I'm not backing down." James nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. "All right, let's get moving." Back at the park, they retraced their steps to the area where the tire tracks had been visible. James knelt down to examine them again, taking note of their direction. "They're headed east," he said, pointing toward the edge of the park. "There's a road that runs parallel to the park boundary. It's probably where they got onto a main route." Eliza looked eastward, her jaw tightening. "Then that's where we start." As they began following the trail, James's mind churned with possibilities. He knew this was just the beginning. Whoever had taken the dogs wasn't just after money, they wanted control, and they'd stop at nothing to get it. But James was just as determined. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt Mia, Daisy, or the puppies, not while he still had a chance to stop them. The abandoned construction site was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of rusting metal in the cold night air. James Wellingham and Eliza Hart crouched behind a stack of concrete blocks, their eyes fixed on the towering crane in the center of the site. Suspended from its rusted arm, high above the ground, was the steel cage. Inside, Mia and Daisy huddled protectively around the three puppies. The cage swayed slightly in the wind, and even from a distance, James could see the fear in their eyes. The faint sound of their whimpers carried across the lot, making his chest tighten. Eliza adjusted her position, wincing as her knees scraped against the rough ground. "They're terrified," she whispered, her voice trembling. James handed her the binoculars. "Look closer. We need to understand what we're up against." Through the binoculars, Eliza saw two men patrolling near the base of the crane. One was burly and unkempt, carrying a crowbar slung over his shoulder. The other was lean and wiry, a pistol holstered at his side. They moved with a calculated vigilance, their flashlights sweeping the area as they exchanged occasional words. "They're armed," Eliza said, lowering the binoculars. Her hands were shaking. "And they're not just watching the dogs. They're watching for us." James nodded grimly. "They're professionals. This isn't their first time pulling something like this." His eyes moved to the crane, studying its structure. The ladder leading to the arm was rusted, its bolts visibly corroded. "Even if we get past them, that climb is risky. The whole thing could collapse under the weight." Eliza looked at James, her expression filled with a mix of fear and determination. "So what do? We can't just leave them up there." James leaned back against the concrete, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced with possibilities, but every plan he considered seemed too dangerous. "We need to think this through," he said finally. "If we make a move without a solid plan, we're putting the dogs and ourselves in even more danger." Eliza nodded, though the weight of the situation was almost unbearable. "What if they realize we're here? What if they hurt the dogs just to send a message?" James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to stay quiet as the lean man walked closer to their hiding spot, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The lean man paused, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "You think he'll pay up?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. The burly man snorted. "He's a billionaire. Of course he will. The dogs are worth more to him than the cash." The lean man chuckled darkly. "We'll see how much he loves them when the cage starts swaying a little harder." James clenched his fists, his blood boiling at their callousness. Eliza placed a hand on his arm, silently reminding him to stay calm. When the men finally moved away, James exhaled slowly. "They're using the height of the cage to intimidate us. It's psychological as much as physical." Eliza swallowed hard, glancing back at the dogs. "If we wait too long, they might do something worse." James looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the site for anything that could work to their advantage. But every option came with risks. The kidnappers were too alert, the crane too unstable, and the area too exposed. As the weight of the situation settled over them, James made a decision. "We need help," he said, his voice steady. Eliza blinked, surprised. "You mean call the police?" James nodded. "I know it's risky, but this isn't just about the ransom anymore. These men are dangerous, and we can't take them on alone. The dogs' lives are at stake, and if we mess this up—" He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Eliza hesitated, then gave a firm nod. "Okay, let's call them." James pulled out his phone and dialed, his voice low as he spoke to the dispatcher. He provided the details quickly but clearly: the location, the kidnappers, and the dire situation with the dogs. "We need them to move in quietly," he told the dispatcher. "If these men realize the police are here, they might hurt the dogs or worse." The dispatcher assured him that a tactical team would be deployed immediately. James ended the call and turned to Eliza. "They're on their way," he said. "But we need to keep an eye on things until they get here. If anything changes, we have to let them know." Eliza glanced back at the crane, her heart aching as she watched Daisy and Mia try to comfort the puppies. "We have to stay close. If anything happens—" James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Nothing will happen. We're going to get them out of this." As they settled back into their hiding spot, the distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. Relief mingled with tension as they prepared for what was to come. This was only the beginning of the rescue, but James and Eliza were ready to do whatever it took to bring their beloved dogs home safely. Chapter 5. The Police Rescue. The faint wail of sirens grew louder as James Wellingham and Eliza Hart crouched behind a stack of rusted steel beams, their eyes fixed on the abandoned construction site. The skeletal structures loomed ominously in the dim moonlight, and at the heart of it all stood the crane. Suspended from its arm, swaying gently in the night breeze, was the steel cage. Inside the cage, Mia and Daisy huddled close to the three puppies, their bodies forming a protective barrier. The faint whimpers of the dogs cut through the tense silence, their fear palpable even from a distance. "They're so scared," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched the binoculars. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression firm but compassionate. "We'll get them out," he said, his voice steady. The flashing red and blue lights of police vehicles illuminated the edges of the site as the tactical team arrived. Officers dressed in black gear moved swiftly and quietly, spreading out to secure the perimeter, planning the operation. Captain Reynolds, the leader of the tactical team, approached James and Eliza. He was a tall, authoritative figure, with calm, calculating eyes. "Mr. Wellingham, Miss Hart," he began in a low voice, "we've assessed the situation. Our first priority is to ensure the safety of the dogs. Can you confirm their location?" James handed him the binoculars. "They're in the cage up there," he said, pointing toward the crane. "Two men are patrolling near the base. One's armed with a pistol, the other with a crowbar." Reynolds nodded, scanning the area. "We'll move in quietly. No sudden moves. If they spot us, they might panic and harm the dogs." Eliza's breath hitched. "What if they do something to the crane?" Reynolds looked at her, his tone reassuring. "We won't let it come to that, trust us." The tactical approach. The officers moved with precision, taking up positions around the site. Two snipers climbed to elevated vantage points, their scopes trained on the kidnappers. Another team prepared to infiltrate the crane while the negotiator stationed himself near the entrance. James and Eliza stayed hidden, their hearts pounding as they watched the operation unfold. From their hiding spot, they saw the kidnappers continuing their patrol. The stocky man with the crowbar seemed restless, pacing back and forth, while the lean man with the pistol kept scanning the site. "They're on edge," James muttered. "This won't be easy." The negotiator's move. The negotiator stepped into the open, holding a flashlight that he pointed toward the ground to avoid startling the kidnappers. "Gentlemen," he called out calmly, "let's talk." The kidnappers froze, their heads snapping toward the voice. The lean man raised his gun, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm here to help," the negotiator said, his tone even. "I know you want money and I know you're nervous, but the only way this ends well is if we work together." The stocky man grunted. "This is a trap. He's stalling." The lean man's grip on his gun tightened. "Back off or I drop the cage." The silent rescue. While the negotiator kept the kidnappers distracted, a second team began scaling the crane from the opposite side. The lead officer moved carefully, his movements precise and deliberate as he climbed the rusting ladder. Mia and Daisy watched him intently, their ears perked up. The puppies huddled close, their small bodies trembling. When the officer reached the cage, he spoke softly. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice soothing. "I'm here to get you out." He secured the cage with a safety harness to prevent it from falling, then worked quickly to unlock the door. The padlock clicked open with a soft snap. Mia was the first to step out, her tail wagging hesitantly. Daisy followed, nudging the puppies forward one by one. The officer carefully placed the puppies into a padded carrier and began his descent, the dogs following closely behind. The tense standoff. Meanwhile, the negotiator continued to engage the kidnappers. "You don't want to hurt those dogs," he said. "They're your leverage. But if you make a wrong move, this whole situation gets worse for you." The lean man sneered. "Don't try to play me. I know how this works." As his attention wavered, a sniper radioed to Captain Reynolds. "The dogs are clear." Reynolds gave the signal, and officers moved in swiftly. The stocky man barely had time to react before he was tackled to the ground. The lean man spun around, raising his gun, but the sight of officers surrounding him made him hesitate. "Drop it!" Reynolds commanded, his voice firm. The man's eyes darted between the officers and the crane. His resolve crumbled, and he dropped the gun, raising his hands in surrender. Union. As the kidnappers were restrained and led away, the officer carrying the puppies emerged from the shadows, followed by Mia and Daisy. Eliza ran toward them, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Daisy. "You're okay," she whispered, burying her face in the dog's fur. Mia trotted to James, her tail wagging furiously. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around her as relief washed over him. The puppies wagged their tails, oblivious to the danger they had just escaped. Ben knelt beside them, laughing as they licked his face. Aftermath. Captain Reynolds approached James and Eliza. his expression serious but calm. "The dogs are safe and the suspects are in custody," he said. "You both did the right thing by calling us." James nodded, his gaze lingering on Mia. "Thank you. We couldn't have done this without you." Eliza looked at Daisy, her heart full. "It's over," she said softly. As the officers packed up and the scene quieted, James and Eliza stood side by side, watching their dogs play together in the safety of solid ground. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they allowed themselves to breathe. The morning after the rescue dawned clear and bright, the light spilling through the windows of James Wellingham's sprawling mansion. Eliza Hart stood near the grand entryway, still awestruck by the sheer size of the home. Her son, Ben, darted excitedly from room to room, his laughter echoing through the hallways. "This place is massive!" Ben exclaimed, peeking into yet another room. Eliza smiled faintly but couldn't shake her unease. Despite James's generosity in offering them temporary shelter, she couldn't help feeling out of place. She glanced at Daisy, who sat calmly at her side, as if sensing her apprehension. James appeared in the doorway, holding a tray of steaming coffee cups. His expression softened as he noticed Eliza's nervous stance. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her a cup. "Thanks," she said, taking the cup gratefully. She looked around the room, its high ceilings and elegant furnishings exuding quiet luxury. "This is a lot to take in." James chuckled, a sound Eliza realized was rare but genuine. "It can be overwhelming," he admitted. "But after last night, I figured you both could use some time to recover." Eliza nodded, her fingers tightening around the warm cup. "We're grateful, really. It's just not what we're used to." Over the next few days, James and Eliza began to learn more about each other's lives. James shared snippets of his past, how he had built his company from the ground up, sacrificing relationships and personal connections along the way. He spoke of Mia, how she had been his anchor during the loneliest moments, and how much the puppies had brought new joy into his life. Eliza, in turn, opened up about her struggles as a single mother. She spoke of the long hours at the diner, the nights spent worrying about bills, and the fierce determination that had driven her to provide for Ben no matter the cost. "I don't know how you do it," James said one evening, watching as Eliza patiently helped Ben with his homework. Eliza shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "You do what you have to, for your family." James nodded, his respect for her growing with each passing day. Meanwhile, Ben had quickly become inseparable from the dogs, particularly Max. The energetic puppy followed him everywhere, wagging his tail excitedly as Ben played in the garden or explored the mansion's many rooms. "Mama, can we keep Max?" Ben asked one afternoon, cradling the small puppy in his arms. Eliza laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think Max belongs with his mum and siblings, sweetie." James, overhearing the exchange, smiled. "You're welcome to visit any time," he said. "Max seems to have adopted you as his favorite human." Ben beamed, hugging the puppy tighter. One evening, as Ben played with the dogs in the garden, James and Eliza sat on the veranda, sipping tea and watching the scene unfold. "You're good with him," James said, his gaze lingering on Ben. "He's a great kid." Eliza smiled softly. "He's my world. I don't always get it right, but I try." James nodded, his expression contemplative. "You've done more than try. You've raised someone kind, curious, and brave." Eliza glanced at him, surprised by his sincerity. "That means a lot coming from you." For a moment, silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that spoke of mutual understanding. Eliza had initially seen James as distant and guarded, a man consumed by his wealth and responsibilities. But as the days passed, she began to notice the small gestures that hinted at his true nature, the way he spoke gently to Mia, how he laughed at Ben's antics, and how he quietly ensured everyone felt cared for. "You're not what I expected," Eliza said one evening as they cleared the dinner table together. James raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? I don't know, she admitted. Someone colder, more detached. James smiled faintly. That's what most people see. It's easier that way. Eliza paused, meeting his gaze. You don't have to make it easy for everyone else. You're allowed to let people in. Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time, James felt the weight of his solitude lift, just a little. By the end of the week, the initial awkwardness between James and Eliza had faded, replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie. They shared meals, stories, and quiet moments, their bond deepening with each passing day. Ben's laughter filled the house, and the dogs brought a warmth that even James's mansion had rarely known. For James, it was a glimpse of what life could be, not just filled with success and responsibility, but with connection and joy. For Eliza, it was a rare moment of respite, a chance to feel cared for and supported after years of facing the world alone. The sun shone brightly over the sprawling garden of James Wellingham's estate, its rays casting a warm glow on the picnic blankets spread across the lush green lawn. The sound of laughter echoed through the air as Ben chased Max and the other puppies around, their tails wagging furiously as they darted between the trees. Eliza Hart sat on the blanket, her hands cradling a steaming cup of tea. Daisy lay beside her, her head resting on Eliza's lap, while Mia lounged contentedly nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the playful puppies. This is perfect, Eliza said softly, looking up at James, who stood a few feet away arranging a basket of food. James smiled, his expression relaxed, in a way Eliza had rarely seen before. It's a good day, he agreed, sitting down beside her. The picnic unfolded with easy laughter and shared stories, the kind of warmth that felt like a glimpse into something lasting. Ben eventually collapsed onto the blanket, breathless but grinning as Max curled up beside him. Best day ever, Ben declared, stroking the puppy's soft fur. Eliza chuckled, reaching out to smooth Ben's hair. I'm glad you think so, sweetie. James glanced at Eliza, his expression shifting into something more serious. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small velvet box hidden there. Taking a deep breath, he stood and extended his hand toward her. Come with me, he said, his voice soft but steady. Curious but trusting, Eliza placed her hand in his and allowed him to guide her a few steps away from the blanket. They stopped beneath a large oak tree, its branches spreading wide like a protective canopy. Eliza, James began, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. These past few days have been unlike anything I've ever experienced. You and Ben, you've shown me what it means to truly care for someone, to feel connected in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. Eliza opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, a faint smile playing on his lips. Let me finish, he said. I've spent so much of my life building walls, keeping people out, but you've made me realize that life isn't worth much if you don't have someone to share it with. He dropped to one knee, pulling the velvet box from his pocket and opening it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. Eliza Hart, he said, his voice unwavering. Will you marry me? Will you let me be the one to build a home with you and Ben, a safe, happy home where we can all be a family? Eliza's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She looked down at James, her heart swelling with emotion. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, I will. James stood, slipping the ring onto her finger as Eliza flung her arms around his neck. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's embrace, as the world seemed to fade away. Ben's voice broke the silence. Wait, what's happening? Eliza and James turned to see Ben, standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of confusion and excitement. Your mum just agreed to marry me, James said, smiling at the boy. Ben's face lit up, and he ran towards them, throwing his arms around both of them. Really? That means we're a family now, right? That's right, Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion. Back on the picnic blanket, Mia and Daisy seemed to sense the joy in the air. They ran toward the group, tails wagging, and the puppies followed close behind. As the dogs bounded through the grass, Ben laughed, chasing after them with renewed energy. Eliza and James watched the scene, their hands intertwined. "This feels right," Eliza said softly, leaning her head against James's shoulder. "It does," James agreed. "It feels like the start of something incredible." The dogs played freely in the sunshine, their golden coats shining like beacons of happiness. Their joy was infectious, a symbol of the love and connection that now bound James, Eliza, and Ben together as a family.